Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation.
Oh, yeah, the one that looks at why kids these days, those born after 1995, seem to be struggling with so much anxiety and depression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It feels like we hear about this all the time, but Haidt's book actually digs into potential causes.
And it's not just describing the problem. His central thesis is pretty thought-provoking.
But what is it? What's the main takeaway?
Well, basically, he argues that the shift from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood is at the heart of it all.
Okay, that's interesting. I can definitely see that shift just in my own lifetime. How does he connect the dots between those two things? What's the link between constantly being online and all this anxiety?
He argues that a few things are happening at once.
Okay.
First, we've become way more protective of our kids in the real world, limiting their freedom to explore and take risks. But at the same time, we've given them almost unlimited freedom in the virtual world, with very little oversight or understanding of the consequences.
It's almost like we're raising them on Mars.
Yeah, he actually uses that analogy.
Right. I remember that from the book. Like creating this super sanitized, hyper-controlled environment, but then just letting them loose online.
Exactly. It makes you think about the unintended consequences.
So where does he start to build his case?
Well, right from the start, in Chapter 1, The Great Rewiring, he presents some pretty shocking stats.
Oh, yeah?
He points out this dramatic increase in depression and anxiety rates among teens, particularly after 2012.
That's right around the time that smartphones and social media really took off.
Exactly.
But is he saying that smartphones are the only cause?
No, he's not oversimplifying things, but he makes a really strong case for the link between increased screen time and declining mental health. I mean, think about it. Smartphones and social media have totally changed the way young people interact. Their sleep patterns, their attention spans even.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we were outside running around playing with friends, getting into all sorts of trouble.
Exactly. And now it seems like kids are glued to their phones even when they're physically together.
It's true. And this is where he introduces that idea of internalizing disorders, right?
Right, like anxiety and depression where you experience distress inwardly. And these disorders are super connected to our social lives. So Haidt's argument is that this lack of real-world social interaction, combined with the constant pressure and comparison that comes with social media, that's what's fueling these internalizing disorders.
The more connected we are online, the more disconnected we become in real life.
Yeah, and that disconnect has real consequences.
But I have heard people say that maybe those statistics are exaggerated.
Oh, you mean like maybe kids are just more willing to talk about their feelings these days?
Yeah.
He acknowledges that self-reported data can be tricky, but he points to other sources that back up the trend.
Like what?
Like emergency room visits. There's been a huge increase in teens seeking help for self-harm and suicidal thoughts, and again, it coincides with the rise of smartphones. It's hard to ignore those numbers.
No, it really does seem like more than just a coincidence. So we're starting to see how the timing lines up with his argument. But how does he explain the mechanism? Like, what's the specific link between this phone-based childhood and the rise in anxiety?
That's where Chapter 2 comes in, social media and the erosion of childhood.
Okay.
Haidt focuses on the decline of what he calls free play.
Oh, you mean like that unstructured time where kids would just run around outside, build forts, invent games, figure things out on their own?
Exactly. And he argues that this decline is a major loss. It's not just about kids getting exercise and fresh air, it's about the crucial social and cognitive skills they develop through that kind of play.
Well, like what?
Things like cooperation, risk assessment, conflict resolution, creative problem solving, all those skills you need to navigate the real world and build resilience.
And social media can't replicate those experiences, can it?
No, not really. He actually argues that social media, while seemingly designed for connection, actually kind of hijacks the natural way kids learn about the world. And he uses two concepts to explain this: conformist bias and prestige bias.
Okay, break those down for me.
So conformist bias is basically our tendency to copy what everyone else is doing.
Oh, like a survival mechanism. If everyone else is running, you run too.
Yeah, exactly. Deeply ingrained in us. And then prestige bias is the tendency to copy those who are perceived as successful or influential.
So we're wired to follow the crowd and emulate those we admire.
Right. The problem is social media amplifies both of those biases.
How so?
Well, instead of learning social cues and norms from diverse interactions in their community, kids are constantly exposed to these carefully curated images and messages from influencers. People who are promoting these unrealistic lifestyles and values.
So they're getting this distorted view of reality.
Exactly. And they're more likely to compare themselves to these idealized versions of people. And it's all happening during this critical developmental period between the ages of 9 and 15, when kids are figuring out who they are and where they fit in.
That makes sense. They're more vulnerable to those online influences because they haven't developed those critical thinking skills.
Exactly. Or the real-world experience, to put things into perspective.
So they're more susceptible to these influences, and they have less experience navigating real-world relationships. It's like a double whammy. But is Haidt saying that all online interaction is harmful?
He doesn't dismiss the benefits completely, but he argues that the sheer volume of time spent online comes at a cost. He uses the analogy of kids being shown movies about walking instead of actually learning to walk themselves.
They might have all the information, but they lack the experience.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture. It's not just about the content. It's about the fundamental shift in how they're experiencing childhood. Or, they're missing out on those essential opportunities that come from free play and real-world interaction. So Chapter 3, Discover Mode and the Need for Risky Play. I love this one.
Yeah, this one is great. This is where he gets into how our brains work.
Okay.
Specifically focusing on 2 modes of operation, discover mode and defend mode.
Okay.
Think of a toddler exploring their environment. They're in discover mode.
Oh, yeah.
They're curious, open to new experiences, and eager to take on challenges.
They're fearless.
Exactly. But when we perceive a threat, whether it's real or imagined, our brains switch to defend mode.
Okay.
Our focus narrows, we become more cautious, even fearful. And Haidt argues that overprotective parenting and, the constant barrage of negative news and social media posts are keeping kids in this chronic state of defend mode.
So they're constantly on high alert instead of being open to exploring and learning.
Exactly. And this is where risky play comes in. He argues that kids need to experience some level of risk and challenge to develop resilience, to learn how to assess and manage danger, and to build confidence. Think back to those dangerous playgrounds we were talking about earlier.
You mean the ones with the tall slides and the seesaws that could really launch you?
Exactly.
I loved those playgrounds.
Me too.
Yeah.
They were so much fun, but it seemed like they all disappeared overnight.
Right. It's also sanitized now.
Haidt argues that those playgrounds served a purpose. He even uses the term anti-fragile to describe this.
Anti-fragile, what does that mean?
It means that instead of just bouncing back from setbacks, you actually grow stronger from them.
Oh, I get it. So it's not just about being resilient, it's about actually benefiting from challenges.
Exactly. Like a muscle that gets stronger when you lift weights. Our brains and our emotional resilience get stronger when we face and overcome challenges.
But we've lost that in modern parenting, haven't we? It's all about safety now.
Yeah, he calls it safetyism. This idea that we need to protect kids from any and all potential harm, no matter how small.
But it's gone too far.
That's the argument. And it's not just about physical safety, it's about emotional safety, too. This idea that kids should never feel uncomfortable or challenged is actually hindering their development.
Trying to create this risk-free bubble for them.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing so, we're actually making them more vulnerable in the long run.
Exactly. And this ties back to the idea of the phone-based childhood.
Oh, right. Because they're not getting those real-world experiences.
Right. They're spending less time engaging in risky play in the real world and more time in this carefully controlled virtual environment.
But even if they're experiencing setbacks and challenges in that virtual world, it's not building that same kind of resilience, is it?
He argues that virtual risks can't replace real-world experiences. You can't learn how to handle a physical challenge or a social conflict by playing a video game.
Okay, so we've laid a pretty good foundation here, I think, with these first 3 chapters. Starting to see how this shift from a play-based to a phone-based childhood, combined with this culture of overprotection, might be contributing to this anxiety epidemic among Gen Z. But let's dive a little deeper into the specific ways that this shift is impacting young people. Chapter 4, Puberty, Plasticity, and Vulnerability seems really relevant here.
Yeah, this is where he focuses on this incredible transformation that happens in the brain during puberty. It's a period of immense, what they call plasticity.
Okay.
Meaning that the brain is incredibly malleable, adaptable.
So experiences during this time have a huge impact.
They really shape the brain's structure and function. So it's a critical time for development, but also a time of heightened vulnerability.
And what about stress? Puberty is already a stressful time. It seems like the pressures on teens today are even greater than when we were kids.
Yeah, no doubt. But Haidt actually makes an important distinction between chronic stress and acute stress. Chronic stress is prolonged and detrimental. It's that kind of stress that comes from constantly feeling overwhelmed and pressured.
Okay, got it.
Acute stress, on the other hand, is short-term and can actually be beneficial. Think of the stress you might feel before a big game or a presentation. Uncomfortable in the moment, but it helps you focus and perform better.
Yeah, you get that boost of adrenaline.
Right. So it's not just about reducing stress in general, it's about providing opportunities for healthy, manageable challenges.
Challenges that can actually build resilience.
Exactly. And he points to the phone-based childhood as a major culprit here. Instead of facing those real-world challenges, kids are spending hours scrolling through social media, comparing themselves to others, feeling overwhelmed by this constant stream of information and stimulation.
So they're experiencing more chronic stress and less of those beneficial acute stressors.
Right. And that leads us to Chapter 5, where he delves into what he calls the 4 foundational harms of excessive screen time.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are they?
Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is. But let's start with social deprivation.
Okay, so we touched on this a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But how does he connect it to excessive screen time specifically?
Well, he presents data showing that teens are spending an average of 6 to 8 hours per day on screens. That's more time than they're spending sleeping. And much of that time is spent alone, passively consuming content rather than engaging in face-to-face interaction.
That's a lot. And even when they are with friends, their attention is often divided.
Right. Like they're physically present but mentally absent.
What about sleep deprivation? How does that tie in?
Well, teenagers naturally have a later sleep cycle.
Oh, yeah, they do.
But school start times haven't adjusted to that. Add to that the blue light emitted from screens, which disrupts melatonin production, and you have a recipe for chronic sleep deprivation.
And we know that sleep is so important for learning mood regulation, physical health. This is huge.
It really is. And then there's attention fragmentation. Smartphones are designed to constantly grab our attention. You know, with notifications, alerts, endless streams of content. It's like our brains are being trained to jump from one thing to the next without ever fully focusing on anything.
I think we can all relate to that. But for teens whose brains are still developing, this constant distraction has to have a major impact.
And it does. Haidt presents evidence that this fragmentation of attention is actually hindering the development of what's called executive function.
Executive function?
Yeah, it's the ability to plan, organize, and control impulses.
Oh, okay.
It's like their brains are being rewired for distraction.
That's a little scary.
It is. And then finally, there's the issue of addiction. This is where he gets into the dark side of technology design. He argues that social media platforms, video games, and other apps, they're intentionally designed to be addictive.
Really?
Yeah, using techniques borrowed from behavioral psychology.
So it's not just about kids lacking willpower.
No. These apps are exploiting our brain's reward system, making it really hard to resist.
So we're talking about addiction in the true sense of the word.
Yes. He uses the analogy of slot machines.
I see.
You know, just like a gambler gets a dopamine rush from a win, kids get a similar rush from likes, comments, new content. It's a constant cycle of seeking that next hit.
Often at the expense of real-world activities and relationships.
Yes, exactly.
So we're seeing how these 4 foundational harms, social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction, they're all working together to undermine the well-being of young people.
And this is really just the beginning. He goes on to explore how these harms play out differently in boys and girls, and then he even delves into some deeper, more philosophical implications of this shift in childhood experience.
This is definitely a lot to digest. We're set to take a break here and pick up the conversation in the next part of our deep dive.
So, you know, it's interesting, these foundational harms we were just talking about, they don't impact everyone equally. Haidt actually dedicates separate chapters to what he calls the special case of girls and the special case of boys, because the ways this phone-based childhood is affecting them are distinct.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We often talk about this issue in these general terms, but it makes sense that there would be gender-specific impacts. So let's start with girls. What does Haidt say about how they're being affected?
Well, the research pretty consistently shows that the negative impacts of social media are more pronounced in girls.
Interesting.
He suggests a few reasons for this.
Okay.
First, girls tend to be more attuned to social relationships and dynamics.
Okay.
You remember those concepts we discussed earlier, conformist bias and prestige bias? They really play a big role here.
So girls are more likely to compare themselves to others and feel pressure to conform to certain social norms. And social media is like a breeding ground for that kind of comparison, isn't it?
Exactly. It's like this never-ending popularity contest. Everyone's presenting these carefully curated images and messages that set these unrealistic expectations. And this pressure is especially intense when it comes to appearance. Girls are constantly bombarded with images of ideal beauty, which can lead to body image issues, eating disorders, a constant sense of inadequacy.
It's like this constant feedback loop of self-doubt and anxiety. And I've also read that girls are more likely to share their emotions and experiences online, which can actually contribute to the spread of anxiety and depression. Is that something he addresses?
Yeah, he talks about this fascinating concept called emotional contagion, where moods and behaviors can actually spread through social networks. Think about those viral trends where teens are encouraged to share their deepest fears or insecurities.
It seems like that could really amplify negative emotions.
Yeah, especially for those who are already struggling. It's like a domino effect. One person's anxiety can trigger a chain reaction.
That's a scary thought. So we're seeing how social media can create this really toxic environment for girls, exacerbating these vulnerabilities, contributing to this downward spiral. So what about boys? How is this phone-based childhood playing out differently for them?
He kind of shifts gears here. He focuses on this declining success and engagement of boys in the real world, particularly in academics and traditional social settings. And he suggests that this trend is actually linked to those same forces that are driving the anxiety epidemic, overprotection, the allure of the virtual world.
It's almost like while girls are internalizing their distress, boys are externalizing it or even withdrawing altogether.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He highlights video games as a key driver of this trend in boys. And while they can offer some benefits, things like problem-solving skills, a sense of community, they can also be incredibly addictive and lead to social isolation.
And again, that addiction is fueled by those same design techniques that we were talking about earlier, right? Those dopamine hits that keep players coming back for more.
Exactly. And he also raises concerns about the potential negative impact of pornography on boys' sexual development and relationship formation.
That's a really tough one to talk about, but it's something we need to acknowledge, right?
Yeah, pornography is so easily accessible online, and it can create these really unrealistic expectations and unhealthy attitudes, especially for young people who are still figuring out their sexuality.
So the virtual world, while offering this sense of agency and escape it, can also be incredibly isolating and detrimental to boys' development in the real world.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really thought-provoking aspect of his argument. He goes beyond the psychological effects and starts talking about the spiritual implications of this shift.
Spiritual implications. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about that.
In Chapter 8, Spiritual Elevation and Degradation, he explores this idea that a life dominated by screens leads to a kind of spiritual degradation.
Not just in adolescence, but in all of us.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay, so we're going deep here.
Yeah.
How does he define spirituality in this context?
Yeah, he's not necessarily talking about religion, but rather these deeper human needs for meaning, purpose, connection to something larger than ourselves.
Okay.
And he argues that throughout history, these needs have been met through collective rituals, shared experiences, a sense of belonging to a community.
Okay, so the things that connect us to each other into something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. But he's suggesting that the virtual world is interfering with our ability to fulfill those needs.
Also.
Well, he suggests that the virtual world, by its very nature, it's a space of constant distraction, self-promotion, superficial connection. It lacks the structure, the depth, the shared meaning that we find in real-world communities.
It's almost like we're constantly bombarded with the mundane.
Yeah.
With very few opportunities for the sacred or the transcendent.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And he points to the rise of anxiety, depression, and a sense of meaninglessness as evidence of this spiritual degradation. Like we've lost our connection to something bigger than ourselves, and we're feeling lost and adrift in this sea of superficiality.
I can definitely relate to that feeling sometimes. So he's making a pretty bold claim here. He's not just saying that excessive screen time is bad for our mental health. He's arguing that it's actually undermining our sense of meaning and purpose. That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. And he goes on to explore how the virtual world can specifically hinder spiritual growth, focusing on these concepts of self-transcendence and awe. Think about those moments when you feel a sense of awe and wonder.
Okay.
Maybe you're gazing at a starry night sky, or listening to a powerful piece of music, or witnessing a breathtaking natural phenomenon.
Oh yeah, I love those moments.
They really make you feel connected to something larger than yourself, don't they?
They do.
But he argues that social media, with its constant emphasis on self-presentation and social comparison, It keeps us trapped in our own egos.
Yeah.
It prevents us from having those experiences of awe and wonder that connect us to something bigger.
It's like we're constantly looking inward, obsessing over our own image and status, instead of looking outward and experiencing the beauty and wonder of the world around us. So if social media is hindering those experiences, what does he suggest we do about it?
Well, he highlights the power of nature as an antidote to this spiritual degradation.
Okay.
He encourages us to spend time in nature, to disconnect from our devices, and to allow ourselves to be fully present in those moments of awe and wonder. He even talks about the benefits of awe walks.
Oh, I've heard of those.
Where you intentionally go out into nature with the specific intention of experiencing awe.
It's like a mindfulness practice, but in nature.
Exactly. And he believes that these kinds of experiences are essential for counteracting the negative effects of this phone-based life, not just for kids, but for all of us.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem. The shift from a play-based to a phone-based childhood, the rise of anxiety, the impact of technology on our mental and spiritual well-being. But what about solutions? Does he offer any hope for turning things around?
He does. In the final part of the book, he kind of shifts gears and presents some potential solutions to this crisis.
Okay.
He acknowledges that changing course won't be easy, but he believes it's possible if we work together.
So it's not about individual parents or teachers trying to fix things on their own. It's about a collective effort.
Exactly. He talks about this concept of collective action problems, where individuals acting in their own self-interest end up creating outcomes that are harmful to the group as a whole.
Right, so it's like the classic example of overfishing. If every fisherman tries to catch as many fish as possible, the fish population collapses and everyone loses. But if they work together and agree on sustainable practices, everyone benefits.
That's a great analogy. And he argues that we're facing a similar dilemma with technology. Tech companies are incentivized to design products that maximize engagement even if those products are harmful to users. Parents feel pressured to give their kids smartphones so they don't feel left out. Kids are bombarded with messages that tell them their worth is measured by their online popularity.
So we're all caught in this system, even if we recognize that it's not working. But how do we break free from these collective action problems? Where do we even begin?
That's a great question, and that's what he explores in the remaining chapters of the book. He proposes specific actions that governments, tech companies, schools, and parents can take to create a healthier environment for children. It's a multi-pronged approach, and it really requires a shift in our cultural mindset.
Okay. I'm really interested to hear about his specific recommendations. I think our listeners are too, but we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've been talking about how Haidt believes we can turn things around for this generation that seems to be getting lost in the digital world. I'm ready to hear about those solutions. Where does he suggest we begin?
Well, he has a whole chapter on the role of governments and tech companies. It's called What Governments and Tech Companies Can Do. He says governments really need to step in and set some ground rules for the tech industry, especially when it comes to protecting kids.
That makes sense. We have regulations for tons of industries to protect consumers, especially children. Why should tech be any different?
Exactly. Haidt advocates for something he calls a duty of care for these companies,
Okay.
where they would be legally obligated to consider the potential harms of their products and actually take steps to mitigate those harms, especially for children.
Like we have regulations for food safety or product safety.
Exactly. You can't just sell a product that you know is harmful, especially to kids.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. But how do you enforce something like that? I mean, the tech industry is global.
Yeah.
These companies are constantly innovating, pushing boundaries. It seems like it would be hard to keep up.
Oh, it's definitely a challenge. But Haidt argues that it's not impossible. He points to other industries where regulation has been successful in protecting consumers. He believes that if we can regulate things like tobacco and alcohol, we can certainly regulate the tech industry to protect children.
Okay, so a duty of care is one piece of the puzzle. What else does he suggest?
He also calls for stricter age verification measures to prevent children from accessing inappropriate content online.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's so easy for kids to lie about their age and create accounts or access websites that are meant for adults. I remember doing that when I was a kid. My parents had no clue what I was doing online.
Exactly. And he suggests a system of device-based verification. So imagine this. When you set up a new device, like a phone or tablet, you would have the option to designate it as belonging to a child. This would trigger age gates and parental consent requirements on websites and apps, regardless of the account the child is using.
So it's like a digital ID card for the device rather than being tied to a specific account.
Yeah.
That's really smart. It'll be a lot harder for kids to get around those protections.
Exactly. And Haidt argues that this would be much more effective and less intrusive than the current system, which relies on self-reported age and is easily bypassed.
Okay, so we've talked about tech companies. What about the role of government? Aside from regulations, what can they do?
Haidt also calls for revised child neglect laws that encourage reasonable independence, to protect parents who are giving their kids age-appropriate freedom. He actually highlights this really disturbing case of a mother who was arrested for letting her 9-year-old daughter play unsupervised at a park while she was at work.
Wow, that's crazy. It seems like we've become so fearful of stranger danger that we've criminalized childhood independence.
Yeah, that's Haidt's point. He argues that these kinds of laws are doing more harm than good. They're preventing kids from developing the resilience and self-reliance they need to thrive, and they're placing this unfair burden on parents, especially those who are already struggling.
It's like we need to shift our whole cultural mindset away from this fear-based approach to parenting.
Exactly. And Haidt believes that governments can actually play a role in fostering this shift by, creating more child-friendly public spaces, promoting outdoor play, supporting programs that encourage independence and responsibility.
Those are all great ideas. But, changing laws and shifting mindsets takes time. What can we do right now? Are there things that schools and parents can do to start addressing this issue today?
Yes, definitely. Haidt has whole chapters on what schools and parents can do. For schools, he advocates for a simple but pretty powerful change, going phone-free.
So he believes schools should ban smartphones during the school day. Completely.
Yep. He argues that it's really the only way to reclaim students' attention and reduce the social comparison and distraction that are just so prevalent in these phone-saturated environments. Imagine a school where kids can actually focus on learning and interacting with each other without that constant pull of their devices.
It sounds amazing. But is it realistic? A lot of schools use smartphones for educational purposes, and parents might worry about not being able to reach their kids in an emergency.
He addresses those concerns. Schools could provide shared devices for educational purposes, and they could have emergency communication systems that don't rely on students having their own smartphones.
Okay, so it's about finding workarounds. Because the benefits of going phone-free outweigh the challenges.
Exactly.
Okay, so going phone-free is one recommendation for schools. What else?
He also encourages schools to become more playful, prioritizing unstructured free play recess, risky outdoor activities.
Bringing back those elements of a play-based childhood.
Yeah, exactly. There's this program he highlights called the Let Grow Project.
Oh, I've heard of that.
It's so simple, but it's a powerful idea. Kids are given a homework assignment to try something new independently. Something that might involve a little bit of risk or challenge.
Like a homework assignment for real-life skills.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of nature-based learning and reducing excessive rules during recess. Kids need those opportunities to explore, take risks, learn from their mistakes, in a safe and supportive environment, of course.
Okay, so schools have a big role to play here.
Yeah.
But ultimately it comes down to parents, right? What does Haidt say parents can do?
He uses this great metaphor of parents as gardeners. He says good gardeners create a nurturing environment for their plants to thrive in. They provide the right conditions, but they don't try to control every aspect of their development.
So we as parents need to create that same kind of nurturing environment for our children.
Exactly. And just like gardeners need to protect their plants from harsh conditions, we need to protect our children from the harms of excessive screen time. His top recommendation is to delay smartphone and social media access for as long as possible, ideally until high school.
I know that's tough for a lot of parents. They worry that their kids will be left out if they don't have a smartphone or social media.
He gets that, but he reminds us that we as parents have more power than we think. If enough of us band together and create a new norm, it becomes easier for everyone.
So collective action is key here again.
Yes, just like with the other solutions. And for parents who are already dealing with kids who are addicted to their devices, he does offer some practical tips.
Like
things like creating device-free times and spaces, prioritizing family activities that don't involve screens, encouraging alternative activities that foster social connection, physical activity, real-world experiences.
So setting limits, creating boundaries, offering healthier alternatives. But it's also about modeling those healthy behaviors ourselves.
Right, absolutely. Kids learn from what they see, not just what they're told.
Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think it can feel kind of overwhelming to think about all the changes that need to happen. What is Haidt's overall message of hope for the future?
He acknowledges the challenges, but he really is optimistic. He believes that by understanding the problem and working together, we can create a healthier and more fulfilling future for young people.
So it's not too late to course correct.
He didn't think so. But it does require a shift in our cultural mindset. We need to move away from this individualistic, consumer-driven approach to childhood and embrace something more community-oriented, an approach that prioritizes children's well-being.
That's a powerful message. We
Yeah.
can't just accept the status quo.
Right.
We have to advocate for change and create a better world for future generations.
And it starts with each of us making different choices in our own lives, setting those boundaries with technology, encouraging play and independence, and advocating for change in our communities.
Well, this has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I think The Anxious Generation is a must-read for anyone who cares about the future of young people.
Definitely a challenge to our assumptions about childhood and technology.
And I love how he offers some concrete solutions that we can all start implementing today.
Yeah, it's not just a doom and gloom book. There's a lot of hope in there.
And as always, we want to bring this back to you, the listener. What could you do to change things? If you could wave a magic wand and design one policy to address these issues, what would it be? Think about it and maybe even share your ideas with others. Friends, family, even your elected officials. We can make a difference, but it starts with each of us.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.